Good morning, Bellevue. It's good to be with you again today. Wish we could see each other in person. I'm tired of looking at Dylan and an iPhone, but maybe soon we'll all be back together and we stare at each other face to face. I want to thank Dylan. I want to thank Kayla for the good job they're doing of putting this all together. Today we're going to look at an idolatrous people receiving their judgment. We're going to depart a little bit from our previous studies on the words of the prophets, and we're going to see what are the results when people ignore these words. I'm sure you're all familiar with the saying, the idiom, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Literally, if you put all your eggs in one basket and you fail or you drop that basket, you lose all your eggs. The risk of throwing all your eggs. It's kind of a silly saying, perhaps. Mark Twain said, it's okay to put all your eggs in one basket if you watch that basket very closely. If you put your eggs in two baskets and you fall, you're probably still going to break all your eggs. So the concept is you need to have more than one plan of action in case that plan goes off. You need to have contingencies. You need to have diversification. Now, that's probably wise counsel in investing, or if you're planning an attack on another army. But it's not good advice when it comes to worshiping God. The people of Israel did not think that God alone was capable of saving them, so they sought to diversify their worship and looking for other sources of security and support. They started worshiping Baal and they started worshiping Asherah. We've talked about that in previous weeks. And they began to form alliances with foreign nations. In some cases, this made them pay tribute to those nations for support. Their spiritual diversification proved to be unwise, and it resulted in disaster in other areas of their life. Israel was a nation that received many beautiful promises from God, and all God asked in response was to worship Him alone. But God also promised, He also warned them that if they forgot Him and they went after false gods and became like the other nations, there would be consequences. And Israel was going to learn the hard way that you cannot half-heartedly serve God. You cannot diversify your worship of God. He wants all of our hearts, and He shows us that everything else is lost. Everything else is worthless. So Israel faced disaster at their own hands because they did not discover that God is the only hope. Now, let's look at this slide. I think this is one of the saddest verses in the Bible. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, and he carried the Israelites away to Assyria, and he placed them in Hala and on the Habor, the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. So how did we get here? What happened to get us to this point? Let's have a brief history lesson on how we got here. Now, we can piece this together from not only the Bible, but also the Assyrian leaders left very good documentation that has been uncovered, and we can piece together this whole story. Now, only once in the 200 years since the end of the combined monarchy did the Israelites of the northern kingdom rise to a level of prosperity compared to those earlier days. Beginning around 781 BC under Jeroboam II, who turned out to be one of the greatest of their kings, Israel began to really prosper and extend their borders, and the people lived very well. Now, part of that was because of the political climate of the time. Assyria had been down, and now Assyria was becoming to a power again, and they began invading the armies of the Syrian countries. In 797 BC, we learned from secular history that the Assyrians had 5 campaigns into Syria and crippled Syria pretty much. Now, by crippling Syria, This freed up Israel. They had no more enemies to fight, and this has freed them and gave them kind of a breather and allowed Jeroboam to kind of restore the kingdom back to the time of David. But beneath this prosperity and beneath all this splendor and luxury, the prophets Amos and Hosea told the people that social and moral decay was eating into the nation's life. So when Jeroboam died in 753 BC, we see that was the beginning of the final act in the history of the northern kingdom. And during the 20 years that followed, we can see that the Israelite kingdom became kind of a prize for a series of conspirators. And we see that mismanagement, misgovernment, and bad leadership aggravated the moral decay of the nation, and it gave an opportunity for foreign intervention. If we look at the chart here that shows the last kings of the northern kingdom, we see that following the death of Jeroboam II, his son Zechariah succeeded him. But he only lasted 6 months, and then he was killed. His assassin was Shallum. Shallum lasted 1 month before he was killed by Menahem around 752 BC. Now, about this time in 745 BC, Tiglath-Pileser II, or called Pul in 2 Kings, you'll see both names in 2 Kings for the same man. He ascended the throne of Assyria, and he introduced a new thought to world politics, one that was different from some of the previous leaders. Previous leaders, they would come in, they would conquer a nation, and they would take the immediate bounty, and then they would ask for tribute to be paid in the future. And this usually lasted until maybe that king stepped down, or there was revolt, and went back to the way it was. Now, Tiglath-Pileser was different. He was smart. He had a very good military mind, and when he conquered countries, he put them under total subjugation, and he kind of combined all his conquests into one to make himself more powerful and make the nations that he conquered weaker. So by 740 BC, he had defeated all the independent kings of Syria and was demanding tribute from them, from the kings of Damascus and the king of Tyre. And then he began to require tribute from King Menahem of Samaria, of Israel. So Menahem began paying this tribute, 1,000 talents of silver a month, to secure the goodwill of Tiglath-Pileser, and as 2 Kings 15 says, to confirm his kingdom in his hand. So Menahem now gave Assyria a foothold into Israel that they would never be able to shake. And every year the tribute got bigger, and every year he had to demand more from his citizens. And then after he died, his son Pekahiah continued the same practice of paying the tribute to the Assyrians. But there was an anti-Assyrian party developing in the country. And then they had an energetic leader who decided it was time to throw off the Assyrians by the name of Pekah. And Pekah killed the king Pekahiah and put himself in charge. And his anti-Assyrian party then began to plot against the overthrow of Assyria. Now, Israel and Syria sat between two great powers, Assyria to the north and Egypt to the south. Now, Egypt was not the power that they were during the time of the Pharaoh. They had been weakened quite a bit, but they had a new king by the name of Sabat, and they thought if they could form an alliance, perhaps with Sabat, they could overthrow the Assyrians. Now, one of the first things they thought, if all these kind of mini kingdoms could get together and form an alliance, they perhaps could overthrow Assyria. So Pekah, excuse me, he got with the people of Damascus and Hamath and Arpad and Tyre and Sidon up in Syria, and Gath and Gaza over in Philistia, and then he thought, if I can get Samaria and Jerusalem and Edom, if I can get all these people, we can have one really strong army, and we can go against the Assyrians. And he got most of the Assyrian nations to agree with him, But the king of Judah, Ahaz, would not agree with him and would not go along with him. So Ahaz became pro-Assyrian, and he refused to join in the alliance, and he began to pay tribute to Assyria as well. And in the midst of all this, the prophet Isaiah spoke out and trying to deter Ahaz from forming an alliance with Assyria, with Tiglath-Pileser. So Ahaz actually began the downfall of Judah by becoming a vassal state of Assyria. So the new army were not able to form a coalition against the Syrian. So Pekah up in Samaria decided what he would do was he would invade Judah. He would depose Ahaz, put his own king in charge, and that way he would get Judah to join in with him. He had very good intents of doing this. But in 734, Tiglath-Pileser found out about this, and he brought his army to the west to put a stop to it. He documents all this in some writings he left behind called his annals. And it tells of all this campaign, how he defeated Damascus and the small kingdoms of Assyria, and how he moved into Moab and Ammon and Philistia, and how he defeated all of those nations. Now, Israel was holding out. Israel was very tough at this time and was holding out. But things were not going very well for them. So finally, the Assyrian army came into northern Israel. We see that in 2 Kings 15. And they took over the towns of Ijon and Abel-Beth-Maachah and Genoa and Kadesh and Hazor and Gilead and Galilee, the northern parts of the nation. Last year, Brenda and I had the good fortune of going to Israel on a vacation, and we actually toured the archaeological sites of Hazor and Abel-Beth-Maachah, where the archaeologists are beginning to find those cities and to excavate those cities and show us kind of what the people lived like during this time. Very interesting. So city after city was being conquered, and the Assyrian army was getting close to Samaria. So the people of Samaria began to fear the Assyrians. So under Hoshea, they defeated King Pekah and took over the nation, took over the kingdom. And Hoshea then agreed to pay tribute to Assyria if they would not come in and destroy the nation. So Tiglath-Pileser placed Hoshea in charge as king, and he put him over the nation. But what a pitiful nation it was, because at that point he decided to export many of the Israelite people into other places in Assyria. He took almost the complete tribes of Zebulun and Naphtali into captivity at this point, and there remained only a small part of Israel, the northern kingdom, that was free from Assyrian rule. Now, for 6 years, Hoshea remained faithful to Assyria. But then when Tiglath-Pileser died in 727, Hoshea decided, well, this was a good time to revolt against Assyria. But under the new Assyrian king, Shalmaneser, they dispatched an army into the west and quickly brought Assyria to its knees again. Now, Hoshea was thinking at this point that with Egypt becoming a rising power under Shabbat, that maybe they could ask Egypt for aid, and Egypt would come up and help them defeat the Assyrians. So they held out as long as they could, hoping that the Egyptians would come up. And we see this in the book of Kings, that this never really happened. And Shalmaneser then just came in and defeated Hoshea and carried him off into captivity at that point. We don't know what happened to him. Obviously, he died in Assyrian captivity, but now the king was carried off into captivity. Now, by 723 BC, the doom of Samaria was obvious, so much that the prophets Isaiah and Micah started prophesying to the southern kingdom of Judah, saying, look what's happening up north, look what's happening to Samaria, the Israelite kingdom, and that thing going to happen to us if we don't change our ways. So, about this time, Shalmaneser died, and he was succeeded by Sargon II. And under Sargon II, he totally defeated Syria and the northern kingdom. He then exported 27,000 more Israelites into Syria. And then, in keeping with the practice of Tiglath-Pileser, he brought families from Babylon and Cutta and Ava and parts of that area into Samaria to replace the Israelites that he moved out. Now, a number of disasters began to happen in Samaria, and including lions coming out and killing the people. And so the people in Samaria now began to think, well, it's because we're not worshiping their God correctly. So they appealed to the Assyrian kings, and the Assyrian king sent an Israelite priest back to Samaria to teach the people the way of the Lord. Now these people, they were okay with worshiping another god. They just added that god to the gods they already worshiped. In fact, they were diversifying their worship, and they said, if this will keep the Israelite God happy, we'll be glad to do it. Now look at this chart here. It shows the captivity. It shows that the purple is the dispersal of the northern kingdom into Assyria and into the Babylonian area, and then the red are the people introduced back into Israel. And you can notice from this that some of the people were carried 300-400 miles away, but some of the people were carried thousands of miles away. Now, with this deportation and with the earlier deportation, the Israelite people began to be absorbed into the colonies that they were carried into. And as a result of this, then the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom became lost. And you perhaps heard of the lost 10 tribes. And these tribes, these people were never heard of again. They blended in with the people where they were taken to, and they lost their identity as a nation. The people back in Samaria and the people brought into Samaria, they lost their identity as a nation as well. So the kingdom of Israel disappeared from our history. So why did all of this have to happen? Let's look at 3 points here. Point 1, idolatry results when people fail to see God's goodness. Let's read 2 Kings 17, 7 through 12. And this occurred, what we've just been talking about, this occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and had feared other gods, and walked in the customs of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel, and in the customs that the kings of Israel had practiced. And the people of Israel did secretly against the Lord their God things that were not right. They built for themselves high places in all their towns, from watchtower to fortified city. They set up for themselves pillars and Asherim on every hill and under every green tree. And there they made offerings of all the high places, as the nations did whom the Lord carried away before them. And they did wicked things, provoking the Lord to anger, and they served idols, of which the Lord had said to them, you shall not do this. So God had made a covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jason, their forefathers. And he revealed his power when he brought them home from Egypt. And he'd given them his law. And he had shown them his goodness. And he'd shown them his love. And all the commands that God gave them were good and they were wise. But the Israelites disobeyed them. And rather than trust in God and finding their greatest joy and fulfillment in obedience of God, they sought their own ways. Their hearts were not satisfied. So they pursued idols and they pursued evil that would never satisfy them. It seems awful illogical to us that Israel would follow after other gods after everything God had done for them. But the truth of it is sin is illogical. Sin is deceptive. Sin tempts us to think we're acting in wisdom when we're acting in foolishness. So our salvation came not through plagues and exodus and laws given to us. Our salvation comes to us from the resurrection of the Son of God. And when we sin, we're being very illogical and we're being deceitful. If we turn away from worshiping the God who saved us to other idols. Now, let's look at the second point. Idolatry prevents people from heeding God's warning. So idolatry keeps people from seeing God's goodness, and it keeps people from heeding God's warnings. Let's look at chapter 17, verses 13 through 17. Yet the Lord warned Israel and Judah by every prophet and every seer, saying, "Turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes in accordance with all the law that I commanded your fathers and that I sent to you by my servants the prophets." But they would not listen. They were stubborn, and as their fathers had men who did not believe the Lord their God. They despised his statutes and his covenants that he made with their fathers and the warnings that he gave them. They went after false idols and became false, and they followed the nations that were around them, concerning whom the Lord had commanded them that they should not do like them. And they abandoned all the commandments of the Lord their God and made for themselves metal images of 2 calves, and they made an Asherah and worshiped all the host of heaven and served Baal. And they burned their sons and daughters as offerings, and they used divination and omens and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. So Israel continued the traditions of their fathers, and they rejected God's decrees and God's covenants. And we see there that some of them even went as far as offering human sacrifices. So they followed and worshiped idols, and they became worthless themselves. It's interesting, if we look at starting in verse 14, the narrator says that Israel, they would not listen, they did not trust in the Lord their God, they rejected the covenant, they forsook all the commands. And then in verse 18, it lists how God reacted. He removed them from his presence, he afflicted them, he rejected them, he thrust them away. So we see the cause and effect. They rejected God, he rejected them. God had pointed out all their sins to the prophets, but the Israelites wouldn't listen. They got upset, they got angry, and even sometimes they killed or threatened to kill the prophets. But each time God offered them grace. God pointed out their sin and asked them if they repent, he would give them grace. It's a story to us. Half-hearted worship is no worship at all. If we turn to God because of fear, like the New Samaritans did, that's not really worship. True Christians worship God because of love. And we run to God because of love, not because of fear. Okay, let's look at the last point. So the Israelites, they failed to see God's goodness. They did not heed his warnings. What's next? It's an obvious conclusion. Idolatry leads people to experience God's discipline. So starting in verse 18. Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them out of the sight. None was left but the tribe of Judah. Judah also did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God and walked in the customs that Israel had introduced. And the Lord rejected all the descendants of Israel and afflicted them and gave them into the hand of the plunderers until he had cast them out of his sight. So we see the consequence of Israel's sin was exile at the hands of the Assyrians. Sin had built a wall between God and Israel. It had separated Israel from God. That's what sin does. Sin separates us from God. So we have to understand the significance of sin and understand the consequences of that sin. Now it's interesting that as I said, the foreigners who came back into Israel, they were unsure how to worship God. So God had these lion attacks, and this brought to them an urgency to learn. But the knowledge of God did not bring true worship. They just added God to their basket of idols, and they did not worship God truly. Just a case that they just continued to diversify their worship and did not worship the one true God. And meanwhile, as this verse tells us, meanwhile, the people of the southern kingdom, they were sinning against God in the same way the northern kingdom was. And they were going to be deserving of judgment from the Lord. But at this point in time, God was withholding judgment from them. You know, they watched the people from the northern kingdom and the consequences they had, and you would think this would be a wake-up call to them. And some degree it did. They lasted a little bit longer, but soon judgment would come to them. And in the coming weeks, that's what we're going to look at. We're going to look at some of the prophets who spoke to Judah and tried to reach Judah and to bring them out of their sin. You know, the good news about the story of Israel is that there is punishment, but there can be restoration. If there's repentance, there can be restoration. The Israelite people didn't see that, but that was God's message to them. That's God's message to us. We sin, but in order for us to avoid punishment, we were restored because of Jesus Christ, because of the act of Jesus Christ going to the cross and taking the punishment for us so that we could be reconciled to God. So that wall that separates us from God, that wall of sin, Jesus Christ removed that wall and took the punishment for us so that we can be restored. We can be restored to God. So the message of the gospel says that we need to give up all our other baskets. And God should be the only God that we worship. Our sin is great, and the idols that we place our trust in are worthless. But because of God's grace, we put our hope in Jesus Christ, and there's still an opportunity for us to avoid that punishment and be restored to God. So next week we'll start looking into the southern kingdom. Until then, we ask all of you to be safe and to look after each other. Thanks.